Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Can Floridians Unite America to Lead on Climate, with our special guest, Carlos Curbelo. This event is co-sponsored and co-hosted by republicEn and the Evangelical Environmental Network, EEN, and is part of the National Clean Energy Week. My name is Wen Lee, and I am the Engagement Director at republicEn. I'm very happy to see so many of you here today, and I hope that we all have a very good experience. Okay, so a quick overview of what we'll be doing today. So first, I'm going to start off with a orientation and an introduction, and then we are going to hear from republicEn's Executive Director, Bob Inglis, and EEN's President and CEO, Mitch Hescox. And they will say a few words of welcome for our speaker, Carlos Curbelo, who will then give his talk. Following that, we'll leave plenty of time for you all to ask Mr. Curbelo questions. But first, let's talk a little bit about what republicEn is. So republicEn is a nonprofit organization. If you are conservative and concerned about climate change, you are not alone, and republicEn is the community for you. We are conservatives talking to conservatives about climate change and what we can do to solve it. We call our movement the EcoRight. Our community consists of thousands of people across the country, and most of us are conservative, but many are libertarian or independent. What we all have in common is the desire to address the serious threat of climate change through the power of free enterprise and to cheer on conservative climate leadership in our country. So that's a little bit about republicEn, and I will let Mitch later describe EEN when it is his turn to speak. Okay, so many of you have used Zoom before. This is the platform that we're using for today's today's webinar, and it has a chat feature. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and use the chat to say hi to everyone. Hi. So you should see a flashing notification on your screen of me saying hi. If you click on that, it will open up the chat box. And this is where you will be able to interact with our speakers today. This is where you'll be able to write comments, submit questions for the Q&A. So make sure you keep your eye on the chat. You can also, if you're on a computer, you can drag the chat anywhere on the screen so that it's like not in your way. So let's make sure it's working for everyone. I see some people have already started. Why don't everybody please go to the chat now and please type in your name and where you are joining us from. So your name, city, and state. So go. Oh, hello, hello. Let's see, DC, Georgia, Miami, New Jersey, Palm Beach. We have Costa Rica. Oh, very excellent. A lot of Floridians. Hello, Idaho. This is great. Thank you all so much. Yes, please continue to use the chat box to interact. And this is also the way that you will be able to submit questions. And so we have the wonderful Price Atkinson on this call who works at republicEn. So at any point during today's webinar, if you have questions, just go ahead and type it in, and Price is going to capture all of the questions and put them together so that we can ask them during the Q&A session. So at any point, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in, and we'll make sure to add them to the queue, okay? Okay, so we are very lucky to have Carlos Curbelo with us today for this webinar. But really, we are all lucky on the EcoRight to have Carlos with us every day. You see, republicEn has known Carlos since the beginning. In fact, our members in South Florida are especially proud of this connection. Here are some photos from back in 2015 when some Florida Republicans explored climate impacts of Biscayne Bay National Park with Carlos, along with park rangers and scientists. So Carlos told us back then, sitting at a picnic table in the park, that whatever the pressures to the contrary, his district was at risk, and he was going to do something about it. Without exaggeration, I would say during his 4 years in Congress, representing the southernmost communities of Florida at the front lines of climate change, Congressman Curbelo did more to bring Republicans and Democrats together in pursuit of bipartisan climate solutions than any other federal lawmaker in the history of the country. He co-founded the Climate Solutions Caucus, which he grew to 90 lawmakers, which is 45 Republicans, 45 Democrats, in less than 2 years. That's really outstanding. He also authored and introduced the Market Choices Act while he was in office. This was the first Republican-led piece of aggressive climate legislation since 2009, when our very own Bob Inglis introduced one. So we're not only grateful to Carlos for his climate leadership, his principled bipartisan leadership, but also for giving us on the EcoRight a hero at a time when we really didn't have any others in office. So we are so thrilled to have Carlos with us today. And I'm actually going to kick it over to Bob Inglis now. Bob is the former congressman as well, and Republican's executive director, and he's going to say a few words. So go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, so thank you, Wynn. Now everybody gets to see the wonderful Wynn Lee, our engagement director. There she is. And we're very happy to be here with Carlos. Mitch will say welcome here in a minute too, but this is our National Clean Energy Week event that we're happy to be putting on here with our friends at Evangelical Environmental Network. And it's important to know that Carlos has not stopped his work on this. He's doing fabulous work now with Deploy Us and with the Alliance for Market Solutions, with the Millennial Action Project. He's also educating folks at Harvard and at Columbia, which that's good stuff to do. And he's a frequent contributor on NBC and a frequent flyer on Meet the Press. So you've all been seeing plenty of Carlos, and we want to see plenty more of him because he's proving that there's life after Congress, and he's continuing to lead as a key person on the EcoRight. So Carlos, we're happy to have you here. And I guess it's now to Mitch to say some things. Hello, Mitch.
Hi, Bob, and hi, Carlos, and hi, Wynn. Sorry I don't have a camera working today, but that's the power of technology. But welcome from the Evangelical Environmental Network. It's quite an honor to be here with two of my heroes. I can remember when I first started at EEN, I met Bob Inglis behind the doors of Congress, behind the chamber, and we actually prayed together. And we spent a lot of time in prayer together. And Bob is a true person of faith, and I'm glad to consider him a great friend. And also for Carlos Curbelo, who is another wonderful friend. We've worked together, we've written op-eds together, because this movement is a moral call. For us at EEN, we consider climate change to be the greatest moral challenge of our time, because it impacts every single child of God on the planet Earth. But it's also the greatest opportunity for hope in building a sustainable prosperity for everyone. And that's what we're about today. EEN represents about 5 million pro-life Christians across the country, several 100,000 in Florida. And we're just glad to be part of this project of moving evangelicals, moving conservatives, in fact, making this a nonpartisan issue to move the country forward to deal with a very pressing problem, a problem that needs to be solved, and there are solutions, but we just need to get, literally, if I can use a non-pastoral word, get our butts in gear and get to work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Carlos Curbelo and allow him to continue to educate us. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see me and I hope you can hear me. I want to thank Wen, Bob, and Mitch for their kind words, overly generous, but appreciated nonetheless. And I want to thank all of you for taking a little bit of your time just to have a conversation here on this important National Clean Energy Week, to share some ideas, to just get to know each other a little better. We're a small but growing community of conservatives throughout this country that understand the urgent need for responsible climate action that respects markets, that respects property rights, that is sensitive to Americans who work in industries that are particularly exposed to the climate threat. So I appreciate any opportunity we have to work together, and certainly with both republicEn and EEN. I had the pleasure of working with during my time in Congress, having community meetings, dialogues, learning about this issue, and just getting to know wonderful people and leaders all throughout the country. So I'm grateful for both these organizations. If you're not involved with them yet, I certainly encourage you to get involved. And as Bob said, I've been blessed to continue my contributions on this issue, despite no longer being in Congress. I'm working with a number of different groups and organizations that are all, in some way or another, trying to build a national coalition for support for responsible, sound climate policy. So thank you all very much. And the topic here today is interesting because as we think about how Congress might get to a solution, might get to a point where Republicans and Democrats can come together to act. Florida, of course, comes to the spotlight. It seems like anytime there's anything related to politics, Florida is somehow in the middle of it. And certainly when it comes to the climate issue, Florida is a frontline state. It's a state where we don't have really a debate over climate science because people can see for themselves the effects that climate change is already having on coastal communities. We have tidal flooding in Miami Beach, in the Florida Keys, an area I used to represent. We have saltwater intrusion in the Everglades. Of course, the Everglades houses the freshwater drinking supply for South Florida, so that is extremely important. And of course, we're seeing what ocean acidification is doing to our coral reef systems all along the South Florida coastline. So for us, this is not anything that we're debating or questioning. On the contrary, we're trying to find ways to move forward. And if you need evidence of that, just look at our Republican governor, Ron DeSantis, who was probably the most conservative person elected to the governorship in the state of Florida, certainly in recent history. And Ron DeSantis is taking environmentalism very seriously. He appointed for the first time in the state a chief science officer, a chief resilience officer. These are two new offices that the governor created and has appointed individuals to lead these offices, and these offices are focused on the challenge and on what might be the best solutions. And that would sure be a great model for Congress to follow, to focus on the science, focus on the facts, and then figure out where the compromise is for a bipartisan solution. And Florida is in a unique position. We have very important climate leaders in the House. Francis Rooney from Southwest Florida. He represents the Naples area, a heavily Republican district. And he right now is probably the most prominent Republican in the House leading in this space. He has filed 2 carbon pricing bills, and he recently drafted a very strong opinion piece that I think ran on Politico. Look that up because it was really uplifting. We have Kathy Castro, a Democrat, who leads the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis that Democrats created when they took over the House earlier this year. Kathy and I have plenty of disagreements, but nevertheless, she is an important Floridian who is in a position of leadership and who could be important when it comes time to negotiating a bipartisan compromise. And then over on the other side of the state, in the Panhandle, we have Matt Gaetz, who is a very conservative Republican, close ally of the president's, and who has also filed a climate change resolution, calling on Republicans to take this seriously, to lead, to make investments in new innovative technologies that could help mitigate all of this. So Florida is poised to become a birthplace of the bipartisan compromise on climate policy. All the factors, all the stars are kind of lining up in that way. And beyond Florida, I'll just say this should be an exciting time for those of us who believe in the importance of this, who understand that, as Mitch said, there's a great moral imperative here. I always tell Republicans, and I used to tell my colleagues in the House, leaving behind an unsustainable environmental debt is at least as troubling and selfish as leaving behind an unsustainable fiscal debt for future generations of Americans. We have to leave the world and our country in a better condition than we found it. And certainly for our children and grandchildren is a part of that. Not to mention the fiscal component of that that Republicans have for a long time, at least discussed. Well, the environment can be seen through the same lens, and it's a moral imperative, a burden that we all must carry to fix this, so that our children and grandchildren can continue living in places like South Florida, like the Virginia coast, South Carolina, Louisiana, and more places that will see the effects of climate change. Another group or sector that I just want to mention before turning it over back to Wen, so that we can have a nice dialogue here, is the agricultural sector. And a lot of people used to get surprised when I would tell them that ag was a big part of the South Florida economy, because South Florida is known for its beaches, for its multiculturalism, for a lot of different things. But people forget or don't know that there's a big ag community in South Florida. Our farmers are increasingly under stress as a result of the changing climate. That's true here in Florida, but it's also true in the Midwest and in other parts of the country. And farmers, just like many other Americans, are starting to wake up to the dangers and to the risks associated with climate change. We've had a busy hurricane season here lately in the Atlantic. And of course, we've had hurricanes for a long time, so I think it'd be disingenuous to say that we have hurricanes because of climate change. But we do know that our hurricanes today are bigger and stronger, and certainly warmer temperatures do contribute to that. So literally, people's lives are at risk. And because Florida is in the middle of all of this, from a scientific perspective, from a political perspective, certainly from a geographic perspective, I'm just extremely hopeful more and more every day that this is the state that's going to bring the country together on this issue, deliver a solution that leaves all Americans better off, and that allows us to do right by our children and grandchildren by building an economy that's sustainable, that's sensitive to the environment, and that understands that all of the resources at our disposal are gifts from God, and they should be treated with care. Wen, that's what I have for now. I want to turn it back to you and to all of our guests who have joined today.
Super. Thank you so much, Carlos. That was great. Okay, well, this is the time where we can start having a conversation and discussion with Mr. Curbelo. So we already have some questions that are in the queue, but if you have some questions, go ahead and put them in now, and we'll make sure to capture them. But my first question that we received is from Laura. So Laura in Florida, she's asking Mr. Curbelo, are the policies for climate change relevant to stemming the red tide, which is ruining our coastal waters? Any thoughts on that, Carlos?
Thanks for that question, and certainly red tide is something I'm very familiar with, although we rarely get it on Florida's East Coast. I like to spend a little time on Florida's West Coast as well, specifically Sarasota, Florida, which is the place that our family has vacationed in since I can remember. And today my wife and I take our daughters there for downtime. And certainly I remember, not this past summer, but the summer before, how terrible the red tide crisis was for Florida's West Coast. A lot of small businesses had to close their doors because there were no tourists, there were no visitors. And of course, there are health effects, health risks associated with red tide, especially for people who have respiratory problems. So red tide is an issue that needs to be further researched. We have documentation of red tide in the Gulf of Mexico going back a couple hundred years. So to attribute red tide exclusively to warmer temperatures and a changing climate would probably be inaccurate, but it's certainly the case that the bacteria, which is the actual red tide, it's a bacteria, benefits from warmer ocean temperatures. That makes it easier for that bacteria to reproduce and to grow, and of course to have all the pernicious effects on marine life and on those of us who enjoy Florida's beaches. So climate change is connected to everything. There are some things that it is causing directly. Certainly higher ocean levels cause tidal flooding and threaten coastal infrastructure. And then there are indirect effects, and I discussed hurricane intensity earlier, and certainly red tide and blue-green algae and all these that live in the ocean, they all tend to benefit from warmer temperatures. So although climate change doesn't cause any of these, it can certainly make them worse.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Larry in Texas. So he says, my understanding is that one of Congress's roles is educating the public, especially on issues that the public may have incomplete or confusing information about. Is this the case? And if so, how can we help Republican elected officials to better inform their constituents on the importance of climate action and solutions?
Well, it's not one of Congress's constitutional roles to educate the public, but I think anyone in a position of leadership should certainly take the time and make an effort to share information with their constituents. And more and more, we're seeing Republican members of Congress, elected officials at the local and state level, lead on this issue and tell their voters and their constituents the facts surrounding these issues. So certainly this idea that members of Congress and other elected officials and other people in positions of leadership, you don't have to be an elected official to lead. I've certainly discovered that this year. But we should all be sharing information. We should all be educating those who are seeking information on the nature of this threat, why we should all be concerned about it, and what kinds of solutions would help improve this situation in the coming decades.
Mm-hmm. And someone just got a little ding there to agree with what you just said. Okay, let's see. All right, next question. Let's see. The Clio Institute, which is in Miami, submits a question. What is the most convincing argument for you when dealing with climate change deniers in our party?
Well, that line I shared earlier, comparing the climate debt or the environmental debt to the fiscal debt, I think when you put it in those terms, a lot of small government conservatives really understand. And look, it's easy to be dismissive of people who don't initially share our views, or maybe who don't even want to hear what we have to say. And to dismiss people like that, or to name something that happens regularly, too often in our country today, what I think is more effective and smarter and kinder and the more Christian thing to do is to try to meet people where they're at. And there's someone out there who's a skeptic for whatever reason, who thinks this is all made up, a hoax, whatever the term is. It's worth having a conversation with that person, and with sobriety and sincerity, sharing information, sharing the facts, pointing to the realities. Again, here in Florida, that's easy because we know what's happening along our coasts. We know what's happening to our coral reef systems. Florida is blessed in that sense to have I'd say, a more developed environmental conscience than most countries. There's a great Floridian consensus surrounding Everglades restoration. So a generation of Florida's children have been raised learning in schools about environmental conservation, about restoring the Everglades and the importance of that. So here in our state, most people are really just willing to listen, constructive, and understanding that we need solutions. But I realize that's not the case all around the country. And we really have to speak to people in ways where, number one, we're respectful of their views, of their human dignity. And number two, we can explain things in ways that it's easier for them to understand. Again, if someone's a small government conservative, we can talk about the fiscal debt versus the environmental debt. If someone is an evangelical Christian, talk to them about the importance of being good stewards of God's creation. There's an angle for everyone, and as we try to work toward a solution, we need to be smart about how to approach each person in a unique way.
Right. Okay, let's see. We have a student in Florida named Danilo. They would like to ask, how can we make sure that politicians know the difference between climate mitigation and climate adaptation? Here in Miami, there is only talk of resilience, but there is not yet any date for the city to be powered by 100% renewable energy. There has not been any public acknowledgement of a climate emergency. People are still debating climate change down here. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you. Education is a two-way street, and someone asked earlier, what should elected officials or members of Congress do to educate the public? But the truth is that the elected officials have a lot more to learn from the public, from individual citizens, than vice versa. So number one, I encourage you always to reach out to your elected officials. I think that in some cases in South Florida, it is true that some elected officials aren't taking this seriously, but I would say that most are. at the local level, at the state level, and certainly at the federal level, because I served with a lot of the current members of our South Florida delegation, and I can say confidently that they all take it seriously. But you're right. There's still a lot to be learned. A lot of people don't understand, as this student clearly does, that solving climate change means adapting to the changing climate and also mitigating. So essentially reducing carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, so that we stop making the situation worse. And to the extent you can meet with elected officials or their professional staff, that's a good conversation to have.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. Let's see, Ted. Ted S. asks, you mentioned compromise several times. I wonder if you can suggest a few specific ideas for that.
Well, I filed what I thought would be good compromise legislation at the in the last Congress, as was mentioned earlier, following in the footsteps of my friend Bob Inglis. And essentially the legislation that I filed was a compromise, an ideological compromise and a political compromise. It involved a modest price on carbon. There was a tax swap component to that. So that bill repealed the federal gasoline tax to avoid what would be a difficult situation for a lot of Americans at the gas pump. That bill also repealed the jet fuel excise tax because we know a lot of people need to travel for work, others travel to visit their families, and we didn't want to see transportation costs increase, which would obviously hurt lower income Americans the most. The bill had a dividend component, so the 20%, the lowest quintile of income earners in our country would receive a dividend that would leave them better off, despite the increase we would see in electricity costs, especially in some communities throughout the country. The bill included a rolling moratorium of the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So as long as emissions reductions targets were being met, the EPA wouldn't have regulatory authority. That was obviously an important concession for conservatives, for small government Republicans, for the free enterprise system. So we really tried to build legislation. And of course, like any carbon pricing bill, it also included a border adjustment component, which would essentially compel the rest of the world to in pricing carbon. So that's an example of what compromise legislation can look like, but there are an infinite number of ideas and examples. Congressman Rooney filed a bill that would price carbon and reduce payroll taxes. So every American, every working American would immediately receive a benefit as a result of that legislation. Democrats have also filed bills in this space. So, and by the way, it doesn't only have to be carbon pricing. There are other ideas out there, like Senator Lamar Alexander, who wants to embark on a Manhattan Project type initiative for the environment, which would involve massive, both public and private investment in research and development, new technologies that could help us solve for this. So there are many good ideas out there. The Market Choice Act was just my iteration of a climate compromise, but there are plenty of good ideas out there. And again, I'm hopeful that Florida becomes the birthplace of those ideas.
Thanks, Carlos. The next question is from James in Texas. He's wondering if you can comment on the nuclear energy initiative in the Senate by Murkowski and Booker.
So I'm not super familiar with that, but what I will share is that, in my view, nuclear must be an important part of a clean energy future. There are some people out there who are still advocating the closure of nuclear plants. Every time we close a nuclear plant, we dramatically increase carbon dioxide emissions because closed nuclear plants are typically replaced by natural gas, which of course of the fossil fuels is the cleanest, but certainly not zero carbon like nuclear plants. I understand the concerns regarding safety. I think our country does a pretty good job of regulating nuclear facilities. I actually live just a few miles from Turkey Point in South Florida, which is a nuclear power plant run by Florida Power and Light. And I feel blessed that we have a zero carbon energy source that has facilitated the growth and the development of our region. So I just think it's important to accept that nuclear is going to be an important component of a clean energy future. Of course, we have to get better at making it safer and making sure that the types of accidents that we've seen in other parts of the world don't happen here. But to turn away from nuclear, at least now, I think would be a major mistake.
Mm-hmm. We have Craig in California. He asks, what talking points do you suggest for EcoRight candidates to win, especially in the U.S. Senate?
I think a sober, thoughtful approach really makes a difference. Look, Republicans leading in the it's a new policy space for Republicans, and many are jumping in and doing good work and leading with sincerity. I point to Matt Gaetz a lot. He comes from I think the most conservative district in the state of Florida, yet he's very forward-leaning about this, and he has a line that he shares publicly, and I'm sure tells some of his constituents. He says, I didn't come to Congress to argue with a thermometer. And that's a very succinct and effective way of saying the science here is real. It reveals a growing crisis. States like Florida will be the first to suffer the most serious consequences, but really all of us are at risk in some way or another. And those of us in positions of leadership should do something about it. That's a winning message, and it's a simple message, and it's a message that is insulated from a lot of attacks. This is not about taking away people's cars or banning certain kinds of meats or any of that. This is about finding sober solutions that allow for economic growth, leave people better off. The only goal here is to accelerate the transition to clean energy that begun, at least a decade ago.
Thank you. Next question is from another student in Florida, Robert, who is actually one of Republicans' county youth chairs. So Robert asks, it seems like when speaking with conservatives about climate change, it seems like it's usually within the context of the marketplace as opposed to contextualized within the effects of climate change. And he's wondering why that is.
Well, I think it's important to discuss both. So obviously the effects of climate change, we've kind of gone through them here a few times, and this is not just an environmental issue. This is an economic issue. When Florida coral reefs are dying, that's bad for tourism. That's bad for charter boat captains. That's bad for home ownership, right? There's a chain reaction. So I don't think we should be discussing one or the other, right? The facts and the science around climate change or market forces and the economy. This is one issue, and there are environmental components to it, there are economic components to it, there are moral components to it. So that's, I think, a big part of winning this debate and finding the solution we need to make people realize that this stopped being an environmental cause a long time ago. This is a broad human cause that involves every component of our humanity. And certainly we want to solve for it. We want to deliver a solution that is respectful to the economy, that is respectful to people's jobs. I think environmentalists early on made a lot of mistakes just saying that, for example, we'll just close coal plants and coal mines. We'll just retrain those people and put them to do other things. That's a really insensitive way of talking about someone in their future, and maybe someone who's worked in that industry for 30 years. I think a lot of lessons have been learned over the years, and we're much better now at realizing that we can't just look at people like assets. And even though we have this big challenge that we need to solve, it doesn't mean that anyone's expendable or that we should just brush over the concerns of those who are most exposed in one way or another, either because they live in states like Florida and in communities that are already bearing the costs of climate change, or because they work in a carbon-intense enterprise that would obviously be affected by any major policy shift. We have to take everyone into account. And by the way, in the bill I filed, we had a special program for those who work in the coal industry, and that included an option to retire with full benefits, because I'm no one to go to someone and say, hey, this job you're doing now, we're going to take it away from you, and we're just going to train you to do something else. We hope that's okay with you. That's just really not a smart way to talk to anyone, and it's not an attractive proposition for most people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Doreen is wondering, how can we get Congress to transition the huge federal tax breaks from fossil fuels to renewables, especially considering that President Trump is still trying to promote fossil fuels?
So the truth is that today we have tax subsidies for fossil fuels, and we also have tax subsidies for wind and solar. Those subsidies are set to expire here in the next couple years. My preference is for there to be no subsidies and for us to price carbon instead, because that's a far more efficient way of getting the outcomes we want. What we want to do is reduce carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and a basic economic principle that almost everyone accepts is that if you want less of something, you should tax it, because the more something costs, the less attractive it is going to be. Now, this isn't some random taxation, the way I think taxing income is, for example, where it's arbitrary in many ways. The idea of pricing carbon is rooted in recognizing that there's a cost to emitting greenhouse gas emissions. South Florida is already bearing that cost. The city of Miami Beach, for example, has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in sophisticated pumping systems to deal with tidal flooding. In the Florida Keys, they're elevating roads. So people are paying for this cost already. It's just not contemplated in the economy. It's as if someone drove by your neighborhood littering, just throwing a bunch of trash out on the street. Well, there's a cost to collecting that and to cleaning up your neighborhood. And when we say that we want to tax greenhouse gas emissions, that's the idea. It's to recognize the cost of pollution and making sure that that's accounted for in our economy. I sure prefer taxing something like pollution than taxing income, which is why I think Congressman Rooney's payroll tax bill is so interesting, because what he is saying is, hey, let's tax something that we actually don't like, that's bad, which is pollution, and let's provide tax relief for something that most people like, which is income, and increase people's income and not punish people for working. So that's the idea behind pricing carbon. It's actually very straightforward and simple. But again, I want to repeat, it's not the only solution out there for solving this challenge.
Okay, that was well said. Thanks, Carlos. Let's see, John in Washington says that you're right that climate is not a partisan issue, and he thinks that you and Bob Inglis and Mark Sanford deserve medals as courageous climate heroes. But he says that your experiences seem to demonstrate that they're acts of political suicide. So he's wondering, is there any way to avoid this martyrdom and to avoid these Republicans who come out for climate action being shot at by current Republican leaders?
So each case is different and each election is different. Some people have advanced the theory that I lost my election because I led on climate policy. Nothing could be further from the truth. If anything, it was unfortunate that climate was not a bigger part of the re-election campaign, because I would have had a better chance at winning. The reason I lost is very simple. I represented the most Democratic-leaning district in the country, held by a Republican in the last Congress, by the Performance Voting Index, which is this technical index that's used to evaluate districts and their political leanings. My district was a D+6, meaning Democrats have a built-in 6-point advantage based on registration and turnout and performance. I lost by 1.5 points in a blue wave. So I can tell you for sure that my leadership on climate made my performance in the last election a lot better than had I ignored this issue or taken an irresponsible position on it by denying science or failing to recognize the nature of the crisis. So I can tell you for a fact that for Republicans in swing districts, leading on climate is attractive. It's good. Suburban voters are tuned into this issue every day more. The Green New Deal is not something I agree with, but it certainly has elevated this issue and has sparked an important national debate and conversations, and it has also pushed conservatives to offer their own ideas and to think beyond just criticizing the solutions that the other side offers. So the good news is that I was the highest performing Republican in my district. I did better than Governor DeSantis did in my district. I did better than Senator Scott did in my district. So I would say that we've turned the corner, that being sensible and smart and leading on climate policy is now a winning issue for Republicans, especially in swing districts.
Great. Okay, we have a few minutes left, so I think we have time for 2 more questions. So George is wondering about weather emergencies. So preparing for the next weather emergency tends to be climate adaptation, in some cases climate mitigation. He's wondering, have you used the idea of emergency preparedness or civil defense as a way to get around the theological argument about climate change? Or do you know others who have done so?
Certainly, climate change is increasingly discussed in the context of natural disasters, emergency preparedness, emergency planning. A lot of the models when it comes to storm surge as a hurricane approaches are clearly affected by higher sea levels, and different jurisdictions have had to adjust their evacuation plans as a result of that. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a threat, this is a challenge that affects every aspect of our humanity, every aspect of our lives. That's especially true for Americans who live in parts of the country that are more prone to natural disasters and emergencies related to weather and other phenomena such as fires, like we see in California and in other parts of the country. And yes, every opportunity we have to genuinely and sincerely discuss this issue and point to the connections between whatever's happening and a changing climate, we should do so. Now, we should be sober about it. If you try to tell a Floridian that we have hurricanes because of climate change, this is someone who's maybe lived in Florida 70 or 80 years, they're going to become suspicious of you or skeptical because, again, we've had hurricanes here for at least hundreds of years. Now, if we talk about the intensity of storms, the size of storms, the frequency of storms, that's different. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that warmer global temperatures are causing those effects.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. We'll do one more question from Cindy in Virginia. She says, as a conservative, I have a hard time with carbon cap and trade programs. Cap and trade seems prone to political dealing and manipulation and bureaucracy. What is your view? Do you think that cap and trade is an acceptable alternative to carbon pricing?
So I understand that view, and I tend to agree with it. I think a price on carbon is transparent. It's easy to understand. It treats everyone fairly. It's a simple consumption tax. Of course, we need to do things like reserving dividends for lower income households to protect them from the higher energy costs and other costs that this would provoke. But I certainly do prefer a simple carbon pricing plan to a cap and trade plan, which is at least a little more complicated.
Wonderful. Thanks, Carlos, for answering all those questions. Thanks, everyone, for these excellent questions. Earlier, Carlos had mentioned Ron DeSantis, who is the governor of Florida. And so DeSantis has actually surprised a lot of people with his initiatives on the environment right out of the gate as soon as he got elected. So we actually want to give you all the opportunity on this webinar right now to sign a letter that we are going to send Governor DeSantis. And so let me show you what I am talking about. So we have, hold on a second. this is the wrong thing over here. Okay. So we're going to send Governor DeSantis a letter. The letter is going to say, thank you for your environmental leadership in Florida. Climate change is an important issue to me. Please continue to prioritize finding solutions to this serious threat to Florida and the larger world. Thank you. So we would love it if people on this webinar could sign this letter. All you have to do is go to republicen.org/DeSantis, and I will go ahead and stick that in the chat right now. And
Wen, let me just say that's a wonderful idea. I think Ron would really like to hear from all of us. And again, we should encourage him because I think he's doing very important work. And as we think about Florida being a potential breeding ground for a compromise, Ron DeSantis can be a part of that. So thank you. I have to let you all go, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
Great. Thank you so much, Carlos. Have a great day. We really enjoyed it. Okay, so republicen.org/DeSantis. I put it in the chat. You don't have to be from Florida. If you are from Florida, of course, please sign it. If you are not from Florida, we still would love to have your voice on it. So republicen.org/DeSantis. I'll put it in the chat again. Bob, would you like to have some closing words here at the end?
Well, just a thank you to Carlos. A thank you to everybody for joining us, and a special thanks to our partner, Mitch Hescox at Evangelical Environmental Network. Thanks, Mitch, for all you're doing and for joining us on this webinar.
Yes, and thank you, Bob. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. You will get a video recording of this in the email after this, and you will also get a short survey so you can tell us what you thought. But thanks again for your time, and please sign the letter and have a wonderful day. So thank you. Bye.